Welcome back. Last night was the final of the 68th annual Eurovision Song Contest, a competition that began in the 1950s as a technical experiment in live, simultaneous, transnational broadcasting, and that people in Europe and beyond have now been watching for nearly 70 years. Never a dull moment, as this celebrated song contest is really far away from controversy. After the European Broadcasting Union confirmed Israel's participation in the contest, there were calls for countries to boycott the event. The UK's entrant, Ollie Alexander, was urged in an open letter from more than 100 queer artists to withdraw in solidarity with Palestine. He did not, whilst bemoaning that it's a fantasy that the contest must be apolitical. I'm joined now by GB News reporter Charlie Peters, who's in Malmo. Charlie, hello. Do the organisers believe that despite all the protests outside, inside the auditorium, they succeeded in having a politics-free contest?
Well, they didn't. That's the long and short of it, because many contestants were issuing political statements on the stage, not only in their final dress rehearsal on Friday, but also last night during the grand final, as it's known. The Irish performer saying that love will triumph hate, and we also saw the Portuguese performer saying peace will prevail. Expected to be references towards the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. We also saw, ahead of the final, several of the jury vote announcers withdrawing themselves from the competition, both the Norwegian and the Finnish announcers saying that they wouldn't be involved, with the Norwegian jury vote announcer specifically saying that they weren't comfortable with it, it didn't feel right, which is expected to be a reference towards the situation with Israel involving themselves in the competition. As you just heard a man interrupt our broadcast there to say free Palestine. He was likely one of thousands who were protesting yesterday throughout this city, because there was a significant march that started here in this square about 24 hours ago, and it moved all the way to the west of the city ahead of several more protesters also migrating from that position to outside the arena. And as the competition started at 9 p.m. here, there was a significant scuffle between protesters and the police. Pepper spray was deployed, several arrests were made as groups were kettled by both Danish and Swedish police and moved away from the venue. Now, they say that politics is not part of Eurovision, but in all the lead-up and in the performance, it certainly was.
Thank you very much from Malmo, Charlie Peters. And I'm now joined down the line from Dublin by Dr. Eurovision, Dr. Paul Jordan. Welcome very much to GB News. So we heard that report just there about the scuffles outside. Certain of the artists making at least veiled references inside the auditorium to political matters. How successful do you think the organisers were at keeping politics at bay?
Good morning, Michael, and yes, greetings from Dublin. I think this year has been really challenging. It's been a very difficult year for the organisers. They're producing a television show. It's not a political rally. It's not a summit. But politics comes into it, just like it does with the World Cup in Qatar last year. So I think they've not really helped themselves by being inconsistent in the past. They've allowed certain songs to be allowed through, which could be seen as political. They've turned a blind eye to some countries and their behaviour in terms of, freedom of the press, freedom of the media. And then they've allowed Israel to compete when there's a really serious situation. So they've not helped themselves. But overall, I think the music was louder than the politics.
Paul, you weren't saying that they shouldn't have allowed Israel to participate, were you?
No, and I think Israel have every right to participate. It's a very different situation to what happened with Russia and Ukraine. Technically, the Israeli broadcaster had not broken any rules. And I do think it's a really complex situation. I understand feelings are running high about the entire situation. Whichever way you look at it, it's awful. I do think it was actually quite distasteful for some people to be booing the Israeli artist. At the end of the day, she's a 20-year-old singer singing a very good song. And, she's not a spokesperson for the government. She's not responsible for what's happening. And it was all in all not really in keeping with the spirit of the event.
There we are. We're seeing Eden Golan performing there. She actually came fifth, a pretty creditable performance. The Israeli security forces, Shin Bet, clearly took her safety extremely seriously. They clearly thought there was a threat to her life and limb. Do you feel there was any exaggeration in that position, Paul?
Well, I think if you look back to what's happened over, Israel's participation in, large-scale international events before, like the Olympics in '72, these things have consequences. So I think they were taking no chances. And I was glad that she did well. It's a good song, but it's interesting that the juries did not vote for her. I think some countries were worried about seeming to be supporting Israel. And this is a song contest. It's not a political rally. But as I say, politics comes into it. But, I wish her all the best. But also I understand calls for peace and freedom as well. It's a very complex situation. And it's a shame that Eurovision this year, for me, was tainted by this.
She did extremely well with the public vote from Britain. Do you think that was well organised, or do you think that was simply a spontaneous explosion of appreciation for the artist?
Well, when it comes to Eurovision voting, it's a very difficult one to predict. I mean, Eurovision is a positive vote. You're voting for someone and not against someone. So all those people who loved her song and wanted to maybe show solidarity or support for Israel would have voted for her. But similarly, with the UK result, we got 0 points from the public. Now, with Eurovision voting, you get 10 chances to vote for a country. You got 1 point to 8, 10, then 12. So technically, the UK could have come 11 with everyone and still scored 0. So it's a very difficult one to predict. And I'm sure we'll be dissecting the results over the next few months.
What about Ollie Alexander? I find it a bit difficult to imagine going into a contest where you are clearly representing your country. I mean, everything is on a national basis. Each artist is described as coming from that country. There's a lot of emphasis given to the nationalism of the thing. For our artist then to say that he was uncomfortable with the Union Jack, which, just to explain to him, is the flag of the country he was representing.
Well, he didn't seem that uncomfortable when he walked on stage carrying it at the flag ceremony. He had that wrapped around him. I think Ollie's, an interesting character. He's an artist. He's got his own mind. He's, very creative, and he's outspoken. He's also spoken about Israel as well. Fair play to him for being true to himself. But at the end of the day, he was representing the UK and the BBC. It's a competition between public broadcasters. They had a gamble, really, in terms of their staging. The UK really had quite a provocative performance, and perhaps it was a little bit too much for some, as we saw in the public vote.
Why do you think Nemo won?
I think Nemo is a very good singer. I think it captured people's imaginations. Switzerland, they've not won since 1988, since Celine Dion won. They were the home of Eurovision. They hosted Eurovision for the very first time in the first contest. It started there in '56. And who knows? I mean, given all the difficulties this year and all the politicisation, it's almost like quite a safe win. Neutral Switzerland wins Eurovision in a year where there's lots of politics. I think the song is very good. The performer is very good. It wasn't my favourite, but, that never really happens. My favourite tends not to win.
The first non-binary artist ever to win. Do you think that was a factor?
I don't know if people would have really known about that. It depends on whether the commentators were communicating that. I think people were hopefully voting for the music rather than anything else. I think that's a moment. Eurovision has these moments. We had Conchita, who was a drag queen from Austria with the beard. We had Dana International from Israel, who was the first trans winner. Eurovision does break boundaries. It breaks, technologies. There's lots of, ambitions when it comes to Eurovision. And it's a technical, as you said in the introduction, technological experiment. I don't think people would have been voting for the singer because they were non-binary. I think they're probably voting for the singer because of the song.
Most interesting. A lot to reflect on. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Paul Jordan. Thanks for joining me this morning.